Dawn breaks over the Pacific. The date is the 4th of June, 1942. On the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, the flagship that led the strike on Pearl Harbor, the mood is triumphant. Engines hum. Deck crews move with practiced pride. The first attack on Midway atoll is complete. Bombs have fallen. Reports are good. Victory feels close enough to touch. But they are wrong. This ship, the single most powerful war machine floating on any ocean on Earth, is already dead. Its fate was not sealed by the American bombers still hours away in the sky. It was sealed weeks earlier by a short, quiet radio message. A message the Japanese themselves intercepted, read, and, without knowing it, confirmed with their own hands. The men standing on that deck this morning are ghosts. They simply don't know it yet. For decades, the story of the Battle of Midway has been told the same way. It's usually called the Miracle at Midway, a tale of impossible odds, where a handful of brave American dive bomber pilots, against all logic and against all sense, stumbled upon the Japanese fleet at its single most vulnerable moment, and in a few unforgettable minutes changed the entire direction of the war. It's a powerful story. It's a moving story. And it is not the truth. It's the ending, not the story. The real story didn't begin in the sky above the Pacific. It began in a windowless basement half a world away, where a small team of misfits fought a war that had nothing to do with bombs and everything to do with belief. Because here is what the popular version leaves out. Midway was not a lucky accident. It was a trap, built, tested, and sprung with almost surgical precision. The Japanese fleet was not simply found. It was lured, pulled piece by piece into a killing ground the Americans had already chosen and were already waiting inside. The Americans didn't get lucky that morning. They knew. They knew where the Japanese were headed. They knew roughly when. And long before the first plane ever left an American flight deck, they were already there, hidden, waiting, holding their breath. And the weapon that made all of this possible, the true weapon that doomed 4 Japanese carriers before a single American bomb was ever dropped, was not a torpedo. It wasn't radar. It wasn't a faster plane or a braver pilot. It was a lie. A small, mundane, almost boring lie about broken plumbing on a tiny coral island, deliberately written, deliberately broadcast, and deliberately aimed at Japanese ears. A story about a water problem, nothing more dramatic than that. The Japanese picked it up. They believed it, and in believing it, they handed the United States Navy the single most valuable piece of intelligence of the entire war in the Pacific. They confirmed their own target. They walked into their own ambush. They sealed the fate of their own ships, using their own signals, their own careful record-keeping, their own trust in what they thought was ordinary chatter between Americans. The destruction of the Akagi did not start the moment the first bomb hit its deck. It started earlier, the moment a tired Japanese signals officer, sitting somewhere far away with a stack of intercepted messages, decoded a report about fresh water on a tiny American outpost, and quietly passed it up the chain of command. So the real question isn't whether the Americans got lucky. The real question is, how? How did 2 ordinary letters, just a simple code name, AF, combined with one analyst's stubborn gut feeling and a carefully worded lie about a broken water system, manage to bring down the most feared naval force on the planet? How did a war fought with paper, static, and patience end in a literal fireball on the deck of an empire's proudest ship? To understand how the Akagi was doomed long before it ever left port, we have to go back. Back past the confidence of that June morning. Back past the sound of engines warming up on deck. Back to a much darker time. A season when the United States Navy was not winning anything. A season of loss, confusion, and quiet desperation. We have to go back to the spring of 1942, to the darkest hours the United States had faced since the war began, when a handful of overlooked, underestimated code breakers, working in a basement that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cold coffee, were about to fight for their own credibility. And in doing so, without realizing it, they were about to decide the future of the entire Pacific War. The spring of 1942 was a season of ghosts for the United States Navy. The ghosts of battleships resting in the mud of Pearl Harbor. The ghosts of sailors lost far away in warm waters, where a combined fleet had been wiped out almost completely. The ghosts of islands that had fallen one after another, their flags lowered in defeat. In Europe, the war was a grinding standoff. In the Pacific, it wasn't even close to that. It was a rout. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan wasn't just winning. It was building a new order across half the ocean at a terrifying speed. Its pilots were the most experienced in the world. Its ships were fast and modern. Its commanders were victors, again and again, with no end in sight. Back home, newsreels showed determined factory workers and brave last stands. But behind closed doors, in the quiet rooms where real decisions were made, the mood was far grimmer. The United States, plainly and simply, was losing this war. And the one real advantage America had, the only one, was hidden from sight. Buried underground, beneath the 14th Naval District building at Pearl Harbor, in a windowless basement filled with cigarette smoke and the constant clatter of machines. There were no guns down there, no ships, just paper, static, and people. This was Station Hypo, the Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, and in the spring of 1942, it was quietly becoming America's last, best hope. The man in charge of this underground nerve center was a Navy commander named Joseph Rochefort. He was an unusual figure in a world built on sharp uniforms and strict discipline. He often worked 12-hour shifts in a smoking jacket and slippers pulled over his uniform. He was a gifted linguist who had spent years studying Japan, not as a spy, but as a student, trying to understand how the other side actually thought. He was, above all, a master of pattern. Not just patterns in codes, patterns in people. Rochefort believed that navies, like men, have habits, routines, small, quiet tendencies that repeat without anyone noticing. And he believed that if you paid close enough attention to those habits, you could find the secrets hiding underneath them. His team was an unusual mix: code breakers, translators, and even musicians pulled from a ship's band after their ship was damaged in the attack on Pearl Harbor. It turned out their musical training gave them an unusually sharp ear for rhythm and pattern, exactly the skill needed to pull meaning out of endless streams of noise. They called their workspace the dungeon, and it earned that name. It was cut off from daylight, cut off from the rest of the world, filled day and night with the same sound, the endless flood of radio messages sent by the Japanese Navy. Their target was formidable. The main Japanese naval code, known as JN-25, was a system built in 2 layers. First, a massive code book, where thousands of number groups stood in for words, phrases, and places. Second, a separate book of extra numbers, used to scramble the message even further before it was sent out. To read a single message, you needed both books, and you needed to know exactly which page of the second book applied that day. It was designed to be unbreakable through pure math, and Rochefort's team wasn't trying to beat it with pure math. They were trying to pick the lock. They knew that even the most careful military system is still run by human beings, and human beings make small mistakes. A tired operator uses the wrong page. A clerk takes a shortcut to save time. By quietly studying these tiny slips, tracking who was sending messages, who they were sent to, how often, and from where, the team at Hypo began building a picture of the Japanese Navy, without needing to read every word. They called it traffic analysis. It was part science, part instinct, and it made Rochefort deeply unpopular with his own superiors. Because 2,000 miles away, in Washington, D.C., sat the Navy's official code-breaking office. Where Hypo was scrappy and close to the action, Washington was slow, formal, and confident in its own methods. They viewed Rochefort's reliance on instinct and pattern as reckless, dangerous, a kind of guesswork dressed up as intelligence. This wasn't just an argument between offices. It was a quiet, bitter rivalry, fought entirely through paperwork and priority. Washington wanted every piece of raw information sent to them first, for review, a process that could take days. Rochefort knew that in wartime, information has a shelf life measured in hours, not days. So more and more, he skipped the formal channel entirely, sending his findings straight to a fellow officer he trusted completely, a man named Edwin Layton. Layton was the bridge between the basement and the battlefield. He was the one who had to walk into the office of Admiral Chester Nimitz and lay Rochefort's fragmented, often incomplete findings on the table and say, quite simply, "This is what the enemy is about to do." In early May, that bridge was tested for the first time. Rochefort's team, piecing together fragments of intercepted messages, correctly predicted a Japanese invasion force was heading toward a location in the South Pacific. It was a stunning piece of foresight. But they had only decoded a small fraction of the traffic. They knew the general direction. They didn't know the exact timing or the exact strength of the force behind it. Washington, looking at the same scattered pieces, reached a different, calmer conclusion. Nimitz had a choice to make, and he chose to trust Rochefort. He sent 2 of his carriers to intercept. What followed was a strange, brutal battle, the first in history where the 2 enemy fleets never actually saw each other with their own eyes. It was fought entirely through aircraft, at a distance, in a kind of blind exchange of blows. The United States lost 1 carrier, another was badly damaged. On paper, it looked like a defeat, but strategically, something important had happened. For the first time since the war began, a major Japanese advance had been stopped in its tracks. For Rochefort, though, the outcome cut both ways. He had been right, but his information had been incomplete, and the cost had been real. A lost ship, lost lives. His critics in Washington finally had something solid to point to. The pressure on him tightened. Everyone in that basement understood one thing clearly. The next time Rochefort made a major prediction, it had to be close to perfect. And deep down, they all knew there would be a next time. And it was coming soon. Even before the last echoes of that battle in the South Pacific had faded, the airwaves over the ocean began to change. The volume of Japanese naval radio traffic surged to levels no one at Station Hypo had seen since the week before Pearl Harbor. It was the unmistakable sound of something enormous being prepared. Somewhere out there, a machine far larger than anything seen so far was spooling up. A recent American raid on the Japanese homeland, small in terms of actual damage, but massive in terms of embarrassment, had clearly struck a nerve. It proved the homeland itself wasn't untouchable. And down in the dungeon, Rochefort and his team could feel the response building in the static. Something big was coming. Something meant to end the war in the Pacific for good. Working late into the night, hunched over stacks of paper covered in 5-digit number groups, the analysts began noticing more and more fragments. Call signs tied to carriers, mentions of battleships, cruisers, dozens of support ships. It wasn't a small operation. It looked like the entire Japanese combined fleet, all pointed at a single target. And buried inside that flood of information, one small detail kept repeating. A 2-letter code. Just 2 letters. It showed up again and again in ordinary-sounding logistics messages, messages about scouting flights, about supply runs, about airfield preparations. It clearly meant a place, a target. But its true meaning was still locked inside the part of the Japanese code the Americans simply couldn't read yet. To most people, it would have looked like meaningless noise. To the men in the dungeon, trained to hunt for patterns inside patterns, it was something else entirely. It was a thread, and Rochefort became convinced that if he pulled on it hard enough, the entire Japanese plan might come undone. The code was 2 letters, AF. It kept appearing in message after message. AF was described as the objective of a major upcoming strike. Scouting flights were being scheduled to observe AF. Supply plans were being drawn up specifically to support an attack on AF. For the United States Navy, figuring out what AF actually meant was no longer just an intelligence puzzle. It had become a matter of survival. Piece by piece, a picture started to form. The scouting flights aimed at AF were launching from bases in the Central Pacific, bases within reach of one particular American outpost, and clearly out of reach of the U.S. mainland, or even Hawaii itself. A simple map told part of the story. An earlier, partly decoded message from months before had also mentioned a supply ship stationed near a location tagged with a related code. Rochefort's team had already guessed, tentatively, that this location was Midway Atoll. It was a fragment, a guess, but it fit. To Rochefort, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. AF was Midway. But in Washington, looking at much of the same raw data, the answer seemed just as obvious and completely different. Their analysts were convinced AF stood for the Aleutian Islands, far to the north, or possibly even a point on the American coast itself. And they weren't simply wrong to think so. Japan really was planning a smaller, secondary strike up north, and Washington's team, without the same closeness to the Pacific picture, read that secondary signal as the main event. They saw Rochefort's focus on Midway as a dangerous obsession, a man falling in love with his own theory. Messages from the capital grew sharper, more pointed. They questioned his methods. They wanted the raw data sent to them, not his conclusions. And caught in the middle of all this was Admiral Nimitz, forced to choose between 2 confident, opposing answers, with almost no room for a second mistake. His fleet now had only 3 carriers left in the entire Pacific. Send them to the wrong place, and there might not be another chance. Rochefort understood something important. He couldn't win this argument with more analysis. He needed the enemy to answer the question for him. So his team built a trap. It relied on one small, unglamorous fact about Midway. It was a tiny coral island with no source of fresh water of its own. Its small garrison depended entirely on machines that turned seawater into drinking water. If those machines ever broke down, it would be a real, urgent problem. The kind any base commander would report up the chain without a second thought. So, using a secure underwater cable the Japanese couldn't tap, Rochefort's team sent quiet instructions to the base at Midway. Broadcast a message, openly, in a simple code the Japanese were known to read. The message should say that the island's main water-making equipment had broken down, and the garrison was now running low on fresh water. It was a small, believable, almost boring lie. And that was exactly the point. Nimitz approved the plan. Days later, the message went out over the radio, drifting into the vast quiet of the Pacific. Then came the hardest part of all, waiting. For 2 days, the basement in Pearl Harbor sat in a strange, tense silence. The trap was out there, floating somewhere in the airwaves. All anyone could do now was listen. Then, an intercepted Japanese message came through. Short, routine, almost boring on its surface. It reported that the Americans had broadcast a message about a location facing a serious water shortage. The location named in that message was AF. The trap had closed. Midway had a name now, confirmed by the enemy's own signals officers, using the enemy's own careful record-keeping against them. The decoded intercept was carried straight to Nimitz. On his desk now sat two very different pictures of the future. Rochefort's warning that the entire Japanese fleet was aiming at Midway within days, and Washington's continued insistence that the true target lay somewhere else entirely. Nimitz made his decision. He set the trap at Midway, but an ambush needs ships to spring it, and one of his three carriers, the Yorktown, had limped back to Pearl Harbor badly damaged, a hole torn deep into its structure. Engineers looked it over and gave their honest assessment: 90 days to repair properly. Nimitz didn't have 90 days. He had 3. What followed was not luck. It was labor. Around 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed the wounded carrier day and night, welding steel over damage, bracing broken sections with whatever would hold, skipping every step that wasn't absolutely essential to keeping the ship afloat and fighting. Less than 48 hours later, the Yorktown steamed back out of Pearl Harbor, patched, scarred, but very much alive. By the second day of June, all 3 American carriers had quietly gathered at a stretch of empty ocean northeast of Midway, a spot they'd nicknamed Point Luck. They were there because Rochefort had told them exactly where to wait, and the Japanese, without knowing it, had told Rochefort exactly where to send them. Far across the ocean, the Japanese fleet moved forward with total confidence. This was the Kido Butai, the first air fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 fleet carriers, the same 4 that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Commanded by a man who had known nothing but victory for 6 straight months, the fleet sailed east with a plan that felt, on paper, unbeatable. Strike Midway's defenses, draw the remaining American ships out of hiding, then crush them with overwhelming force. Their confidence rested on intelligence that seemed solid. Their scouts reported nothing unusual at Pearl Harbor. Their radio intercepts suggested the American carriers were scattered far away, damaged, or already sunk. As far as they knew, only 1 or 2 American carriers could possibly still be afloat, and those, they believed, were far to the south, nowhere near Midway. The idea that 3 American carriers might be waiting nearby, fully armed and ready, wasn't just unlikely to them. It was considered impossible. One small warning sign had already appeared and been dismissed. A planned scouting flight, meant to double-check the area around Pearl Harbor, had quietly failed. The refueling submarine sent ahead had found an American ship sitting exactly where it wasn't supposed to be. The flight was canceled. It should have been an alarm bell. Instead, it was treated as a minor inconvenience. Confidence, built on months of victory, made the warning easy to ignore. The fleet sailed on, blind to the fact that the enemy already knew they were coming. On the morning of June the 4th, that blindness caught up with them. American patrol planes spotted the fleet. Word raced back to Pearl Harbor and out to the waiting carriers at Point Luck. The trap that had been built weeks earlier in a quiet basement was finally ready to close. One by one, American planes lifted off their decks and turned toward the enemy, flying on nothing but the strength of an idea that the enemy would be exactly where the intelligence said it would be. At 17 minutes past 9 in the morning, a young squadron commander leading a group of American torpedo planes broke radio silence. He had found the Japanese fleet. But he was alone. The rest of his group had drifted off course and missed it entirely. He chose to go in anyway, without fighter cover, leading 15 slow, aging aircraft against the most powerful carrier force on the planet. He had told his men earlier that if only 1 plane was left, that plane should still go in and try to land a hit. Now, seeing 4 enemy carriers ahead of him, he was about to test that promise himself. The Japanese response was immediate. Fighter planes that had been circling high above dropped down to meet the attack. Against these fast, heavily armed fighters, the old torpedo planes had almost no chance. One after another, they were shot down. All 15 planes were lost. Only one man from that entire squadron survived, found later floating in the water. Minutes later, a second group of American torpedo planes arrived from a different direction. The result was much the same. Most were shot down. Not a single torpedo found its target. Then came a third wave from yet another American carrier. Again, heavy losses. Again, no hits. By mid-morning, the picture looked like a disaster. Out of roughly 40 American torpedo planes sent in that morning, most had been lost. Dozens of pilots and crew were gone. And for all of it, not one bomb, not one torpedo, had touched a single Japanese ship. On the deck of the lead Japanese carrier, the mood was almost calm. The attacks had been easy to brush aside. It felt like final proof of everything the Japanese command already believed about their own superiority. But something important had happened, hidden inside that apparent disaster. To fight off wave after wave of attacking planes, the Japanese carriers had been forced into sharp, constant turns, throwing their own tight schedule into disorder. And their fighter planes, the same ones that had just wiped out the American torpedo squadrons, were now low on fuel, flying close to the water, completely out of position to defend against any attack from high above. The sky above the fleet, for a brief window, was left almost completely open. At that exact moment, far to the south, a group of American dive bombers was flying low on fuel, badly off course, minutes away from having to turn back and abandon the search entirely. Their commander made one final decision. Spotting a single Japanese destroyer racing across the water below, clearly hurrying to catch up with a larger fleet somewhere ahead, he made a guess. Follow that ship, and it will lead us to the rest. It was a gamble with no guarantee, but it was the only option left. Minutes later, breaking through a thin layer of cloud, the American pilots saw it. 4 Japanese carriers, sailing together, decks crowded with planes still being prepared for their next strike. And above them, nothing. The Japanese fighters were still down near the water, completely out of position. For the first time all day, the sky belonged to the Americans. The lead pilot gave the order to attack and rolled his plane into a steep dive, aiming for the lead carrier, the same one that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Down below, deck crews looked up just in time to see what was coming. The bomb fell and struck home. What followed was not simply an explosion. It was the direct result of everything that had happened in the hour before. Decks crowded with fuel and unsecured bombs, fighters pulled out of position, a schedule thrown into chaos by the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons that came before. The fire that tore through that carrier's deck had, in truth, been building for weeks, ever since a lie about broken water pipes had drifted quietly across the Pacific and been picked up by the wrong ears. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning. The war in the Pacific had just changed direction, not because of luck, but because months earlier, in a windowless basement filled with cigarette smoke and the sound of clattering machines, a small team of codebreakers and musicians had learned to listen closely enough to hear the truth hiding inside an empire's own quiet mistakes. The bombs were only the ending. The real battle had already been won.